Now, officially, into Ecclesiastes. So, last week, we introduced the introduction into part 2, looking at human limitation. We launched the sort of brand new thesis, who knows what is good, what is tov, and we explored sort of some better than proverbs, and in those better than proverbs, we sort of determined, okay, so there are some things that are good that we can say, okay, this is better, but at the end of the day, wisdom is sort of hard to navigate because only God knows the outcomes of our actions. And so as we try to navigate life, sometimes we have decisions to make that are hard to decide what is going to be better because we just don't know the outcomes of our actions. And so looking especially at verses 15 through 22, taking a look at living righteously, we examine the dangers of putting all of our trust and hopes and say, okay, well, if I just follow this sort of success scheme, if I say, okay, if I'm good, if I pray, if I follow the Lord, then my life's going to go great. What's the problem with that? It doesn't always happen. And whenever, I'm always convicted by those verses that say, don't be confounded by your dependence on righteousness. Don't let it be the thing that trips you up. Because there is no guarantee that that's what's going to be the outcome. And so we determined that wisdom is hard to figure out. And so now we're diving into the next section. We are continuing these themes here. So we're diving in, and I apologize, we're going to have one of those verses jump right in right away. But so starting in verse 25 of chapter 7. We're continuing Kohelet's exploration of the question, who knows what is good? I turned my heart to know and to search out and to seek wisdom in the scheme of things, and to know the wickedness of folly and the foolishness that is madness. Now, the very first phrase here, turned or returned, Kohelet isn't really looking at anything that he hasn't examined before, so the word turned can also be translated as returned, which is one of those sort of funky things about the Hebrew language. It's like either for the first time or we're coming back to it. I sort of favor that of return. Again, it's we're examining all of these things that we've looked at before. All the way back to chapter 1, Kohelet says in verse 16, I said in my heart, I acquired wisdom, surpassing all who are over Jerusalem before me. My heart had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceive that this also but is striving after wind. And so we have this repetition of these same themes here. Now we do have these three terms that are used. We have seek and to search out and to know, and these three terms indicate completeness. He's saying, hey, I did my utmost to try to figure out these things. I really did my homework by every possible path. Now this term here, Heshbon, scheme, we're going to see this word scheme here translated 3 times in this next section. Two of those times it's going to be translated, the meaning is really going to be the account or reckoning. So Kohelet is presenting a summary of his conclusions on how life works. And once more, he's telling us that he's not just looking at wisdom, but also its opposite, the stupidity of wickedness and the madness of folly. So I just kind of like that alternate translation there. Now we're going to look at a specific example of what he's looking at. These are some of the hardest verses I will have you know to translate, and to understand. And I find something that is more bitter than death, the woman whose heart is snares and nets, and whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God escapes her, but the sinner is taken by her. Behold, this is what I found, says Kohelet, while adding one thing to another to find the scheme of things, which my soul has sought repeatedly, but I have not found. One man among 1,000 I have found, but a woman among all these I have not found. See, this alone I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. Anybody notice a little bit of a repeated word in these verses? What word is repeated way too many times and is altogether a tongue twister?
Found.
Yeah, and you're like, what in the world is going on here? And there are actually there's a wide range of interpretations for what's going on in this section. The wording of the Hebrew is complicated. If Kohelet had been one of my students, I would have written in the margin, revised for clarity. Because as you're going in, you're like, oh my gosh, what in the world? At first glance, it seems to not really paint a pretty picture, right? Women are not exactly, showing up in shiny colors here. Some people try to parse this by saying, hey, well, Kohelet is writing to primarily a male audience, and so he's highlighting the difficulty of finding a wise woman because he himself is a man, and so he's writing to a male audience, and that's possible. Others basically sort of throw in the towel, and they're like, well, no, Kohelet's a misogynist, and he just hates women, and you're like, cool, yeah, I don't really like that emphasis there. Still, others say that the parallel language that's used here, so one man among 1,000 I found, but a woman among all these I have not found, is actually intended to be more of a merism, so the intended meaning being that no one is righteous, and I do like that. So he's saying, hey, and again, you have to parse the Hebrew a little bit differently in order to make that work, but it is a possible interpretation. Another possible thing that's going on here is that this is a saying that Kohelet is reacting to. So he's saying, hey, this saying right here, one man among 1,000 I found, but a woman among all these I have not found, that this is the thing that he has not found. And you're like, wait, what? So Kohelet is saying, okay, well, the wise say, okay, there are wise people out there, right? There's a wise guy amongst several thousand, but women, you can't even find one. And Kohelet's like, nah, even that's not true. I haven't found that anyone is righteous. No, not one. And I do kind of like, I like that one the best, especially if we cast our minds back to the beginning of the whole section. We intentionally set out with the understanding that Kohelet is revealing the difficulty of acquiring wisdom. And he explored that series of proverbs, demonstrating that all of those traditional sayings were paradoxical and ultimately fell short of delivering perfect outcomes. And this, I think, is continuing here. Again, so verse 26 is laying out some traditional wisdom, right? So if you go through the book of Proverbs, you'll see a lot of references to the wayward woman, and that can be found, first of all, to refer to the lady who is actually an adulteress. So, hey, you have this woman, she's out to pull men off the path, and if you are a wise young man, you will steer away from the adulteress, because she's not a good person to follow after. There's also this theme of Lady Folly contrasted with Lady Wisdom. These are two pictures that are presented. You can either follow Lady Wisdom or you can follow Lady Folly. And so again, that's the picture that's presented in Proverbs. That hey, if you can be a good man and you can follow this up, whatever your explanation is, but it's one-sided. It's one-sided. It's addressing that hey, the women are okay. So if you maybe you grant a little bit to Lady Wisdom, okay, there are some women that are kind of okay, but if you just be righteous, if you just avoid those women, then you're going to be fine. And Kohelet says, not so much. Yes, it is true that you will be better off if you stay away from the adulterous women, right? But Kohelet is saying, I think, no one is righteous. Kohelet says, I tried to figure out how wisdom does its thing, but I can't because humans are trash. So, interestingly too, this is the only other mention of Kohelet in the entire, but besides at the beginning and end. So Kohelet is mentioned at the beginning, Kohelet is mentioned at the end, and this seems to be the center right here. And I think the language is difficult to parse, perhaps, and I resonate with this especially as a writer. As he's struggling to figure out wisdom, he made his language perhaps particularly hard to parse through so that you struggle to figure out his meaning. I don't know. Maybe that's what like my heart's sort of hope that he was like, I'm going to throw the word down a whole bunch of times to sort of make it a little bit more difficult, emphasizing the struggle to understand wisdom. And so I think it's possible that what Kohelet finds is more bitter than death isn't the wayward woman, nor even the proverb itself, but the fact that even the height of really good advice is somewhat empty and lacking. And that's just a possibility. And so as mankind has abandoned God's explanations for their own wisdom, at the end of the day, wisdom is ultimately unable to provide the answers that we seek. And I think that's a bitter pill for Kohelet to swallow. So, moving into the next section here. Chapter 8, verse 1. Who is like the wise, and who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the hardness of his face is changed. The word interpretation here, I think, is better translated as solution. Who knows the solution of a thing? Now, it's possible to read this first part, who is like the wise and who knows the interpretation of a thing, sort of along the way that I read it, kind of positively. Like, who is like the wise? Sort of like this accolade. It's like in The Chosen, where they recite the, I can't remember what it's called now, it escapes me, the woman of valor. Oh, woman of valor, who can find? And it's like, it's actually an accolade. So that's a possibility. I think it's possible, but maybe kind of weird in this context, unless Kohelet is using it as, again, something to critique. So if one person says, oh, well, who is like the wise? And that's just so great, and he's sort of coming back to critique it. The other way to read it is something like, who, like a wise man, can solve these great paradoxes and sort out wisdom. And so I think that is also a possible read of this section. Once again, like in the first part of chapter 7, it does seem like Kohelet is offering some qualified praise of wisdom. It does some good, but only some. And this slides into this first verse, and this verse is going to transition us into a whole section on relating to the king. A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the hardness of his face is changed. And part of the difficulty here is that we have a lot of pronouns, and with pronouns you're not really sure what the pronoun is referring to. But I think that we can say certainly that what this verse is telling us is that wisdom tells you when to be C3, calm, cool, and collected. How many of you, don't raise your hand, have ever been called into a situation, whether it was with a boss or with a coworker or a neighbor or something, and like intentions were high, and you were like, okay, I'm going in, and I'm gonna be cool. I'm gonna be calm. And you were like, and what did the Proverbs say, right? What kind of answer? A soft answer turns away wrath, and that's true, right? So whenever, and specifically here, we're going to see going into the context of being in the king's presence. Hey, if the king calls you before him, if you're calm, cool, collected, you can sort of get out from under it. We think about perhaps the example of Nehemiah. So Nehemiah was under the service of King Artaxerxes, and whenever he heard the news about Jerusalem and how it wasn't doing so hot, he went into the king's presence and he freaked out. Why did he freak out whenever the king noticed that he was sad?
Because you're not supposed to be sad.
You're not supposed to be sad. You're not supposed to be sad before the king, right? And he was very aware that not being calm, cool, collected could have a very bad outcome for him. But, he prayed and he said, okay, well, I'm going to apply some wisdom, and that even though my face did betray what I couldn't keep inside, I'm still going to employ wisdom in this circumstance. And in Nehemiah's case, of course, the Lord granted him favor. And so, in a hell world, wisdom does grant us some survival capability. Sometimes. But with powerful rulers who are not always good, sometimes wisdom may not quite be enough. Verse 2. Keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. For the word of the king is supreme, and who may say to him, what are you doing? So a brief note, the word say is not in the original Hebrew. At some point it eventually got added in. There's nothing substantial that really changes, but it's just a puzzle to sort of figure out if something was dropped before it, or if something was added, who knows. So keep the king's command because of the oath before God. It's sort of an interesting phrase there. Commentators differ on what the meaning is. Some people say that it means that the king is promising that he will do a good job to God, sort of like, okay, the presidential oath, okay, I swear before the Lord. Considering the hellahness of this section, I don't know if that's the best interpretation. Another one that's possible is that the subject is swearing fealty before God to the king. And so we've already talked in chapter 5 about how God views taking oaths seriously, and so this would be motivation to obey the king even if the king is somewhat of a moron, because you're like, hey, well, the Lord said you made a vow, and so go ahead and follow through on your vow. It's also possible to interpret it as God giving authority to the king. So because of God's oath to the king, because the king has that authority from the Lord, well, sometimes you just gotta do what the king says. And so I think any of those interpretations are possible to keep the king's command because of God's oath. Verse 2, part 2 and verse 3, don't be afraid or paralyzed, do it. So don't be hasty can also be translated don't be afraid. This is another one of those Hebrew words that you're like, I think that's kind of different. Those are kind of different words, but there you go, that's Hebrew. So you can also translate it, don't be afraid, leave to accomplish the king's command right away. And so just a couple of possibilities. It's very technically weird section. And you're just like, who knows what's going on here. Verse 3, part 2 is also weird. So don't take your stand in an evil cause. I don't know about you, but I haven't gotten the impulse throughout Ecclesiastes that his audience is like, oh man, my heart is set to do evil things. That just hasn't been the vibe that I've been getting. And so it is also possible to translate. So the literal Hebrew is, don't stand, matter evil. Which is kind of interesting. And so I sort of retranslated it here to say, hey, even if it's a crummy assignment, don't plant your feet against it. So even if the king sets you off to do something and you're like, this is not a great task, sometimes you might be advised, go ahead and do it. Why? Verse 4, for the word of the king is supreme, and who may say to him, what are you doing? What good can you accomplish with your protest? An example that has ended well, but that I shared last time I talked through this class. Paul Vaughn is one of the pro-life protesters who was arrested for violating the FACE Act. And the circumstances of his story are especially egregious because he was there, he wasn't the protest, but he was there specifically to be the negotiator between the protesters and the police. So he was there to say, hey, I'm here to make sure everything goes smoothly. Whenever the police arrived, he was like, hey, so they're here protesting. If you're telling them to get out, I'll let them know that, hey, if they stay, that they'll have to be charged with trespassing. But if not, then, if they don't want to go to jail, then they can leave. And so he was the one sort of mediating between the police and the protesters. He wasn't actually part of the protest group. He was just there to help everything go smoothly. And he got arrested later. Like, they broke into his house, busted down his door, dragged him off, and it was like this horrible. He was facing up to 10 years in prison, and he literally he did all of the things right that you would think that you should be able to do. He really did his best to act wisely. Now, fortunately, President Trump did end up pardoning him, and so he was able to he escaped with just being in under house arrest for several months, which you're like, oh, good. The government only oppressed you to the point where you were under house arrest for, months, and you had to get drugged anyway. And so did wisdom guide his actions and perhaps prevent him from getting, shot in the face? Probably, yes. But the benefits of wisdom are constrained by the hebel conduct of the powerful. And I do think that as well. Remember that Kohelet is sort of doing a both and. And so while people may say these things, and while this may be kind of good advice, I do think that Kohelet is at the same time offering some critiques as well. So let's keep rolling. Verse 5, whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing, and the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. For there is a time and a way for everything, although man's trouble lies heavy on him. For he does not know what is to be, for who can tell him how it will be? So this is the first part here is another traditional wisdom proverb. So to say, hey, if you just obey the king, just keep your head low, you'll be fine. Just hang in there. And sort of again continuing the phrases that we previously looked at. And what's the rationale for this proverb? Well, there is a time for justice. And we already looked at this back in chapter 3, verse 17, when we said, hey, there is a time coming for justice to be established. Verse 17 of chapter 3 says, I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and every work. There's a time coming for justice, whether in this life or the next. And I do like the word for justice here. It's the word mishpat, and it combines these two words together. Whenever you see just way or the way, it is in fact that word mishpat. It means judgment or matter, ordinance, and it really captures that idea of God's justice coming down and making things right. When you hear Jewish scholars talking about the word mishpat, it's not just a word of, okay, God taking the big stick of justice and smacking people, but it's that restorative justice, that it's making things right. And so, the wise response in many circumstances is not to freak out against the king and just sort of stomp your feet and say, well, how dare you? Even if there's injustice afoot, because justice is on the way. But at the same time, hold on to that thought. Now, the word that is translated for, although for throughout this passage, is actually one Hebrew word that's kai, ki, I don't know. Do I speak Hebrew? No. And I can't keep this conjunction in my head. It just escapes me. So the problem with this conjunction is that it has a wide range of possible translations. That, for, because, when, as, though, as, because, that, but, then, certainly, except, surely, since. I don't know about you, but that's a wide range. And depending on which conjunction you choose, it might alter the translation perhaps just a little bit, and the meaning just a little bit. I'm going to give you my best understanding based on the context, but you can definitely go a whole bunch of different directions with this section. And so I'm just going to come on to this new section. So I think that it's best translated, whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing, and the wise part will know the proper time and justice. For there is a time and justice for everything. And I would conclude that first verse right there. But as you go forward then, it says, but man's trouble lies heavy on him, for he does not know what is to be, for who can tell him how it will be? So this interpretation keeps the pattern that Kohelet seems to have established of laying out some wisdom, which really is some skillful living, really does work out in some situations, but critiquing it and laying out its limitations. It's well and good to counsel patience, but if someone's undergoing the trial in the moment, guys, that's hard. Going back to that example of Paul Vaughn, he didn't know that he was going to get pardoned by President Trump. He was facing up to 10 years in prison. He and his wife and their 11 children, I think it may have been 12 by the time, I think she was pregnant. And so they would have been separated for all of that time. And to say, oh, well, God's got justice coming for you someday, so just hang in there. It's like, oh my gosh, sometimes we say things, right? As Christians even, we say things to one another. And yes, is it true? Yes, just hang in there, and okay, that can be true, but at the same time, sometimes the wisdom doesn't always work out again in the way we would see. And sometimes that knowledge that yes, it'll work out someday even falls short to help you in the moment. Not knowing whether or not you're going to see justice this side of eternity is hard. And that waiting is hard. And that's a key struggle with wisdom, I think. It should allow us to predict what will happen, but in fact we don't know. And so we don't have control. The next 4 lines that we're going to look at are going to show how these circumstances escape our control and manipulation. No man has the power to retain the spirit or power over the day of death. There is no discharge from war, nor will wickedness deliver those who are given to it. All this I observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun, when men had power over man to his hurt. So we have this word, I can't, ruach. Someday, I'm gonna sit with a Hebrew scholar and they're going to drill me in getting the back of the throat noise, and then I'm gonna be able to speak Hebrew. I feel like that's the word, the sound that I just can't. So ruach can be translated either spirit or wind. So you can either translate this as straight parallelism, so you don't have power to hold back your spirit, or power over the day of death, or you can translate it as a simile. So as you can't control the wind, you can't control death. The phrasing is actually literally, no man has the power to hold back wind with wind. And so I sort of got the mental image of if you stand outside, and you know how kids sometimes just do silly things, like there's wind blowing and then they're like, as if they're like trying to change the direction of the wind. Can you do that?
No.
No, like even as great scientists as we have, who have all of these great technologies to try to like circumvent hurricanes, do they have the power to do that? No, you can't hold back wind with wind. Moving forward to the next set of verses, there's no discharge from war. We do know that from passages like Deuteronomy 24:5 that sometimes people could be excused from serving in the army. When a man is newly married, he shall not go out with the army or be liable for any other public duty. He shall be free at home 1 year to be happy with his wife whom he has taken. So does the law allow for exceptions to this rule? So is there discharge from war according to this verse? Yes. This verse. Is there discharge from war according to the law? Yes. I'm so sorry. I must take a second. So, what does this verse mean? If the law specifically allows for people to escape from being called out to war. One possibility, considering the context of being under the authority of the king, is that if the government has it out for you, you've displeased the king in some way, he's like, oh, you just got married? Oh no! We think about the example of King David, right, and Uriah the Hittite, and whenever David went out to get Bathsheba, he was like, Uriah, hey, go out to the front lines, my man. And we're going to pull back and, oh no, Uriah the Hittite is dead. Oops. Another possible thing is that Kohelet is referring to the practice of paying a person to fulfill one's military obligations, which was a common practice in Palestine during the Persian period. And I think that possibly connects as well, especially as you look at the previous one, no one can similarly dodge death. No matter how powerful a person may be, they don't have the power over their own death. Either way, the emphasis is the same. Wisdom doesn't allow you to have that escape from death. I was thinking of no escape. No escape. It's funny, you just spelled just like the word escape. Let's go! And so it's like Finding Nemo. Finding Nemo.
Love it.
This is my target audience yet again. So the final line here, verse 9, says, hey, all this I observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun. Kohelet isn't removed from this experience. He's not just sort of sitting on his couch at home eating popcorn and saying, okay, well, I'm just sort of watching these things happen. He's in the midst of the struggle itself. He's watching these things play out in real time. In the next section, Kohelet is going to continue his reflection on the problem of those who do wicked things. So let's jump right in the long section. Then I saw the wicked buried. They used to go in and out of the holy place, and were praised in the city when they had done such things. This also is heaven. Because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, nor will he prolong his days like a shadow, because he does not fear God. There is a Hebel that takes place on earth, but there are righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. I said that this also is Hevel. Now, as I read through that entire section, hopefully it sounds a little bit familiar because Kohelet is repeating some of the themes that we've just talked about last week in chapter 7, that, hey, sometimes the outcomes that you would expect to see aren't the things that you would see. Examining verse 10, the Hebrew, this is another section where it's a little bit hard to follow, hard to interpret, different way to potentially lay it out. So then I have seen the wicked buried, those who used to go into and from the holy place out holy. That's the literal Hebrew. I'm just giving you word for word out of the Hebrew. And they are forgotten in the city where thus they did too. And you're like, God have mercy. Why? Why? What is going on? There are at least 7 different ways to interpret these verses, different ways to put the meaning together, so you know. I do think that the ESV does a decent job of capturing what I think the meaning is. Could we be wrong? Yes, but I think the ESV's version is fairly good. Very interestingly, the word that in the ESV is translated thus, yes, okay. Can also mean righteous. So sorry, thus. Where they thus also. I don't know why it doesn't match up because I took the leader. So it's not the ESV. It's the New American Standard Version. From the interlinear. So from the New American Standard Version, thus can also be translated righteous. And so another translator proposed this translation: the wicked came from the holy place and were buried. Those who acted righteously were forgotten. And so, in this interpretation, the wicked are receiving one kind of treatment, seen for their religious performance and buried honorably. But the righteous were not honored with the burial. And I think that translation potentially does fit in with the flow of the rest of the section. And remember, too, that for a Jew, burials were really important. We don't esteem them nearly to the same degree as they did back then. But burial and remembrance are things that should happen to the righteous, not to the wicked. We would hope that the wicked would be the ones who were forgotten. And so Kohelet says, hey, this is Hevel. And I think that this here would be a good translation to say this is frustrating, this is foul. Chapter 8, verse 11 is almost self-explanatory. So delayed justice only produces more wickedness, whether in the original evildoer or in those who are emboldened to commit similar crimes. One example from relatively recent news stories is that of Blake and Riley. So she was a 22-year-old nursing student who was out on her morning run. And she was raped and killed. And a Venezuelan illegal immigrant was convicted of the crime. And what's infuriating is that he was arrested previously in September of 2022. And then he was released. And I'm not here to get into an immigration debate, but what I will say is that if the man had faced sentencing and had been extradited from the country immediately, there's a very good chance that Blake and Riley would be alive today. And I say that this too is Hevel. And so Kohelet continues. I brief note, so some commentators are not sure whether Hevel points up or down, and I would say it's both frustrating and foul that the wicked are honored and that people escape evil and enable evil. In this next section here, Kohelet is emphasizing that wickedness doesn't pay, which seems to very much contradict what he said just before. But again, this is what Kohelet is inviting us into. He's inviting us into the struggle of real wisdom whenever it hits the ground, and the truths of Scripture, and saying, hey, we see some things that seem to be paradoxical. We see in some cases, okay, wickedness seems to thrive, but here Kohelet's going to say, but it doesn't. Even though it may seem to, at the end of the day, it doesn't. He returns to our motif, our theme of fearing God, that this is a key to navigating life well. But we do have this weird phrase, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow. Now, previously, whenever we've encountered the word shadow, it's usually in conjunction with the word hebel, and its meaning has not been long, but rather what? Short. Yeah, because shadows, do they have any impact? Do they last for a really long time whenever the sun is sort of going through its stages in the day? No, it's here and it's gone. And so I do think that it's better to look at the Hebrew because the word that's translated because, once again, can also mean the one who. And you're like, why does it have such a range of meaning? It's fine. But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days. Like a shadow is the one who does not fear before God. And to me, that makes a lot more sense. And so that just seems to flow a lot better. And yet, right after this, Kohelet turns on a dime and says, okay, yeah, God's justice is a good reason to center your life on wisdom, not join the dark side. But look at the injustice. As a result of living in a broken, fallen world, we all encounter these same challenges. And what's really interesting is that once again, right on the heels of this kind of dark, kind of depressing statement of complex, realistic look of life, Kohelet continues into our fifth enjoy life refrain. And I commend joy, for man has nothing better under the sun but to eat and drink and be joyful, for this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. We have a repetition again of earlier themes. He recommends eating and drinking, those basic necessities that can provide light and joy. And remember, joy is one of our key words, simcha, pleasure, enjoyment, and satisfaction. And I really appreciate how it's here at the point of the book where Kohelet is showing the limitations of wisdom. The despair of our heart that comes from seeing the injustice and the brokenness of the world. That he makes a direct commendation. He doesn't just make an observation. He commends joy. An answer to the question of 6:12, for who knows what is good for man while he lives the few days of his life which he passes like a shadow. This is what Kohelet recommends as what is good, what is tov. Joy that is a gift from God. Yes, our lives are brief. Yes, they are fleeting. But in the midst of all of the shadows, God sends the light. All of those gifts are from him. And so Kohelet says, yes, your life is brief, but enjoy it. God. The word companion here is actually the word that's translated for who will go with him. It's join or cleave. And I love that because it's not like, okay, well, I'm just going to sort of bring joy on for like a mile or two and then he's going to fall off by the wayside. I'm like, oh no, there he went. He's off by the, no, come back later maybe. No, it's that cleaving one to another. Even through great loss, great trial, great pain, the peace of God, the joys of the Lord can be our strength. Now, I was tempted so strongly whenever I was putting the lessons together to end it right here because it ends on such a high note. I'm like, it's beautiful. But the chapter really flows to verses 16 and 17. So we're gonna look, there's stuff on the screen. We're gonna continue. We're gonna keep going to the end. Here we go. Verse 16, when I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes see sleep, then I saw all the work of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out. As we're thinking about who is not getting sleep, it's possible to refer to Kohelet, that Kohelet isn't getting sleep as he's trying to figure these things out. It's possible also to apply it to just sort of the population that he's looking at, that, hey, as you guys are trying to figure these things out, as you're trying to go through all of these struggles, you're not getting sleep. I say, wait, why not both? Why not both? I think that it does describe how all of the effort and all the futility and all the aggravation of the struggle to obtain wisdom that Kohelet has both undergone and observes in humanity. And we have these phrases, I applied my mind to know wisdom, to observe the business, that's the inyan, that's that wearisome labor of everything that is done on earth. And what does he conclude? Well, I don't get it. I can resonate, right? Whenever I look out at the world and I'm like, oh God, it's so hard for me to see what you're up to. Because I'm limited. Because I'm fallen. I can't understand everything that he's doing in the world. But while that may feel discouraging, I think this also gives us an opportunity for faith. As one commentator concludes, if we could know with certainty what actions bring prosperity, happiness, and long life, then we could control life and even God. But such knowledge and such powers are ever out of reach. And so as we journey under the sun, through life's perplexities and injustices and unanswered questions, so those things may haunt us, but we can take comfort in knowing that we can trust the God who is, again, beyond the sun. And so, as we slide up here, we have unfinished stuff, so we're going to slide right into the hiker and hike. We are, I'm trigger happy. I've done this too many times. In this section, we've seen how really wisdom is just hard. It's hard to figure out. There are things that are traditional wisdom that you would think, okay, well, if I do this, then I'm going to be okay. And yet we've explored in a variety of means that, okay, it's not that guarantee that we would hope that it would be. It's not that, okay, well, if I just do A, B, and C, then my life is going to be great and full of happy charms, and that I can somehow get, like that one commentator said, I can somehow control God. But that's not the case. And as we lean into that struggle, we can trust Him. So that's the hike your own hike. We're moving into prayer. That's it.